This iTunes Top 5 album is out now.
I put a spell on you, yeah, 'cause you're mine.
Featuring epic brand new pop anthems and classic big band hits.
You won't admit you love me.
From me, British singer-songwriter Shane Hampshire.
Your side, let the rain fall down on me.
Search for Shane Hampshire's debut album, available to stream now.
Hey guys, I'm Christina Prudent, and this is Enchanted Ink. Welcome to the show. Come one, come all to the greatest show on earth. And no, I'm not talking about this podcast. I'm talking about the circus. We're taking a step back from the paranormal today to learn about the history of modern stage magic through one of my favorite books of all time, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I am definitely one of those people that they warn you about. I 100% judge a book by its cover. Unless I'm looking for something specific that's been recommended to me, I kind of just wander through the library or the bookstore and wait for a cover to jump out at me. And that's exactly how I discovered Night Circus. Back when I was living in Boston, I worked in the Prudential Tower, the Pru, which is basically an indoor mall with an office tower at one end. Similar to like a Ponce City Market if you live in Atlanta, but a lot less awesome. Anyway, I'm not sure if it's still there, but there was a Barnes & Noble in the Pru that I used to like to browse on my lunch breaks. And one day, I saw this book on the shelf and I just had to see what it was all about. The original cover art, if you've never seen it, look it up for Night Circus. The original cover art shows a hand with a circus tent in its palm, all black and white with little pops of red, but it all looks like it's made out of paper. It's just beautiful. And I didn't know it at the time, but what was inside the cover was even better. So as always, we will use the book to guide our exploration of today's topic. Let's start with the history of stage magic. Stage magic, or illusion, is one of the oldest performing arts in the world. For centuries, ancient kings and pharaohs employed magicians in their courts to entertain them. And as a matter of fact, the earliest recorded magic trick, the cup and balls trick, is nearly 5,000 years old, and it's still performed to this day. There's no way you haven't seen it. Apparently, all of human history has seen it. But you take 3 cups and 3 balls and you line them up. Then you take a cup and put it, face down on the table. You take a ball and put it on top of the center cup, and you cover it with the other 2 stacked on top. And when you lift the whole thing, the ball is underneath it as though it fell through the cups. Then you keep repeating the process, stacking balls and cups, until all 3 balls are back on the table, having quote-unquote fallen through. It's literally the oldest trick in the book and the precursor to modern stage magic. Now, as we know, magic itself has an incredibly complicated past and was both celebrated and denounced throughout the centuries, depending on time, place, and your neighbor's mood. And in Europe specifically, magic was thought of as a real thing that you obtain by promising your soul to the devil. But magic tricks as a form of entertainment have a surprisingly long history. One of the earliest books documenting magic for entertainment purposes is called Natural and Unnatural Magic, written in 1489, and it describes and explains old-time magic tricks. Another famous debunking attempt, I'll call it, is The Discovery of Witchcraft, which was published in 1584 by an Englishman named Reginald Scott. And it mostly aimed to prove that magicians are, in fact, not supernatural and actually use tricks like sleight of hand and misdirection to perform their illusions. But of course, the late 1500s was also at the height of the historical witch hunts, so that book just did not go over well because no one was trying to hear it when they were accusing each other of bewitching their farms. It wasn't until the early 18th century, as belief in witchcraft started dying down, that stage magic even became respectable. Right around the same time, a gentleman named Philip Astley was actively developing what would become the framework for the modern circus. He set up the first modern amphitheater to house his horse riding show in London in 1768. Now, Astley didn't invent trick horse riding, nor was he the first to introduce acrobats and clowns to the English public, but he was the first to create a space where all of these acts were brought together to perform a show under one roof. He performed in a 42-foot diameter ring or circle, which is the standard size used by circuses ever since, and also how they eventually got their name. It was in 1770 that he began to hire jugglers and clowns to fill the space between acts and create that full circus experience that we know and love. Now, while all of that is going on in England, it was actually a Scotsman named John Ricketts who opened the first circus in the US in Philadelphia in 1793. And apparently, George Washington attended a show there later that year. So it's unclear when stage magicians joined the fray as a common circus act, but it seems to have been around the mid to late 1800s, which is where we begin our story in the Night Circus. The circus arrives without warning. No announcements precede it. It's simply there, when yesterday it was not. Within the black and white striped canvas tents is an utterly unique experience full of breathtaking amazements. It's called Le Cirque des Rêves, and it's only open at night. But behind the scenes, a fierce competition is underway. A duel between two young magicians, Celia and Marco, who've been trained since childhood expressly for this purpose. Unbeknownst to them, this is a game in which only one can be left standing, and the circus is but the stage for a remarkable battle of imagination and will. The game must play out, and the fates of everyone involved, from the cast of extraordinary circus performers to the patrons, hangs in the balance, suspended as precariously as the daring acrobats overhead. We'll be right back after this quick message break. If you haven't heard of Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. Completely free. I love free. I'm sure you love free. So that should be motivation enough. But the cool thing about it is, it allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. And now, back to the show. Alright, so we begin the Night Circus in 1873 when we meet Prospero the Enchanter and his daughter Celia. He's apparently a well-known stage magician, and so the first 2 chapters describe not only his show, but some of his backstage life in the theater office and dressing room. I love that Morgenstern chose to begin this story right alongside the very beginning of professional theater magic shows in Victorian Europe. The founding father of modern stage magic was a former clockmaker named Jean-Robert Houdin, who opened a magic theater in Paris in 1845. So this takes place some years after that in 1873, but not too far in the future. Prior to that, magic was mostly performed at fairs, so he really pioneered that transition to a full performance that an audience would pay to see. By the end of the century, so like the late 1800s, large theater magic shows became the norm. There was a British magician named John Neville Maskelyne? We'll go with Maskelyne, who truly pioneered the reinvention of traditional magic tricks for the stage. He was the first to really take advantage of hidden mechanisms like trapdoors and things like that, things that you couldn't do performing among the crowd at a carnival or circus. And he invented illusions that are still performed today, his most famous being levitation. Now, quick fun fact. The model for the look of a typical magician, a man with wavy hair, a top hat, and a goatee, was a French magician named Alexander Herman, or Herman the Great. So you go ahead and hold on to that for the next trivia night you go to. Now, if we fast forward a little bit, I want to make sure I mention Howard Thurston. Thurston, originally from Columbus, Ohio, got into magic after attending one of Alexander Herman's shows and ran away to join the circus. He ultimately became the most popular magician of the early 1900s. His popularity even rivaled Harry Houdini, who at the time was seen more as an escape artist. But anyway, that brings us right back around to the circus. I mentioned earlier that Astley was the first to utilize a 42-foot circle as his stage, and that eventually became the standard and the hallmark for circus performance. And the purpose for that was fairly straightforward. Audiences could view the performance from all angles, which was something a traditional stage couldn't offer. So just from a practical standpoint, the circular pattern was brilliant. It just made sense. And so the circus main stage became known as the ring, and the announcer for the circus became known as the ringmaster. The main function of a ringmaster was to direct the attention of the audience. You have to remember, we're talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s, in the days before modern lighting equipment and microphones. Most of the acts performed accompanied by the circus's in-house band, so it was the ringmaster's loud voice that was necessary to cut through the noise and get the audience's attention to announce the next act. They're well known not only for their iconic costume, that bright red and gold tailcoat and top hat, but also for their over-the-top, exaggerated introductions. Every act was always the greatest, the biggest, the most dangerous in the world. So ultimately, the ringmaster became a major part of the circus experience. And actually, in the early days, it was most often the owner of the circus that acted as ringmaster. Now, I think everyone would agree that the most famous ringmaster in history would be P.T. Barnum. He's the pioneer of the phrase, the greatest show on earth, and the Barnum and Bailey Circus was the very first to utilize 3 rings. It just rolls off the tongue now, we don't think about it when we say 3-ring circus, but before Barnum that just simply didn't exist. P.T. Barnum is actually an incredibly interesting person in his own right, and I could fill an entire episode just talking about him and his life, but just know that he remains the most prolific circus and sideshow creator of all time. And the Barnum and Bailey Circus maintained worldwide fame until its final show in 2017 at Long Island's own Nassau Coliseum, not too far from where I grew up in New York. Actually, I recommend you check out The Greatest Showman starring Hugh Jackman if you're interested in Barnum's story. It's a great movie, beautiful music, and just really, really fascinating. Now let's switch gears for a sec and talk about the structure of a circus itself, and more specifically the Night Circus. Traditionally, the entire circus takes place in one giant tent known as the Big Top. Thanks to Barnum, Big Tops housed multiple rings and stages to accommodate not only the various performers, such as clowns, contortionists, fire eaters, but also animal acts like elephants and lion tamers. But, fun fact number 2 for the show, while Barnum was the first to drastically expand in size, he wasn't the originator of the canvas tent. That title goes to a gentleman named Joshua Purdy. In 1825, he was the first to use a big canvas tent for his traveling circus, rather than setting up in permanent buildings in whatever city he happened to be in. Now, what made the Night Circus unique is that it didn't have a big top or a ringmaster. As we learned in the synopsis, it was a competition between Celia Bowen and her opponent Marco Alistair. So rather than have all the acts within one tent, each performance had its own. Or smaller acts like the jugglers and the contortionists performed on platforms set up between the tents to create more of that festive atmosphere. The patrons were left to wander on their own and discover attractions as they went along, and each new tent added to the circus was an entry in the challenge created by either Celia or Marco. And remember, they used real magic, so they were able to create amazing attractions like the ice garden that never melted and a carousel with painted wooden animals that moved and breathed. It was all unbelievable, but just plausible enough that the patrons were none the wiser. The other very unique detail about the Night Circus was that it was designed entirely in shades of black, white, and gray. The only colors that you'd see, besides obviously the clothing of the patrons, were the pops of red. Maybe a red scarf here, a hat there, or a rose in the pocket of one of the Rêves, which was the special fan club of the circus that followed them from city to city. This is, of course, in absolute contrast to any traditional circus, which uses the brightest possible primary colors to attract a big crowd. And big tops are always depicted with red and either white or yellow stripes and colorful hand-painted banners. And I want to talk about that for a sec because it's super interesting. Sideshow and circus banners first appeared in Europe during the early 1800s. They hung outside of shows or booths to lure in customers to see their freaks and curiosities like the two-headed cow or the bearded lady. At the height of their popularity from the 1870s to the late 1960s, sideshow banners were used at carnivals and traveling shows all over the world. Fred G. Johnson and Snap Wyatt are two of the most well-known sideshow banner artists of all time. Fred Johnson painted banners for the O. Henry Tent and Awning Company for 40 years, and his banners are now highly collectible and sell for thousands of dollars each, although most that have survived are in museums at this point. But that rarity makes them even more sought after, and collectors out there will pay top dollar. So to close out, I want to talk about where circuses are today. I used to go with my parents as a kid in the 90s, but traditional circuses have just started to lose their popularity now in the late 2000s. The most popular contemporary circus would be Cirque du Soleil, but their format has long since departed from that of any traditional circus into more of an arena production with theme and storylines and live music. I also want to note that compared to the traditional circuses of the past, animals are rarely used now. The contemporary approach tends to focus more attention on overall aesthetic impact and really relies on character development and costume design to convey a storyline. So unfortunately, it seems like the circus as we know it is nearly gone. And that's it. That's our show. I hope you all enjoyed hearing about the history of the circus as much as I thoroughly enjoyed telling it. And by the way, the secret to the ball and cups is that there's a fourth ball hidden in the middle cup the whole time. Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you love the circus and want to tell me about it, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Enchanted Ink Podcast, on Twitter at Enchanted Ink Pod, and at our home on the web, enchantedinkpodcast.com. If you like the show and want to hear more, make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please go ahead and leave a review so we can grow our Enchanted network. Thanks, guys. See you next time.